Your grandmother poured raw milk straight from the pail into your glass, and nobody blinked. She brewed sassafras tea on the back porch and let it cool in a mason jar by the screen door. Half the neighborhood did the same thing every summer, and it never crossed anyone's mind that the government would one day step in. But between the 1960s and today, federal regulators quietly pulled dozens of everyday foods off American tables for good. A sweetener that millions of Americans trusted in their morning coffee was banned overnight. A root bark tea sipped across the South for generations was declared unfit to sell. And one kitchen shortening that sat in every pantry in America was ruled so dangerous that the federal government made it illegal for any food manufacturer in this country to use. So hit subscribe, because here are foods that were perfectly normal to eat in the 1960s, but are illegal now. Number 24. Sassafras root tea. On a slow Sunday afternoon, a hill country cook would dig the red roots, scrub off the dirt, and boil them down into a rosy tea that tasted faintly of root beer and smelled like spring itself. It was the family tonic, served hot in winter to thin the blood and cold in summer to settle the stomach. The whole holler ran on it. Then in December of 1960, the Food and Drug Administration ruled that saffrole, the oil that gives sassafras root that warm flavor, caused liver tumors in lab animals. They declared any food containing it adulterated and pulled it from the market entirely. The root bark is roughly 80% saffrole by oil, so the genuine article was finished overnight. That is why store root beer lost its old bite and why a real cup brewed from the wild root crosses a line the government drew 60-some years ago. The Sunday tonic is now contraband. Taco Bell, a beloved fast food chain, found itself in hot water when its beef recipe was exposed for containing much more than just beef. In fact, the fast food giant's beef was revealed to be only about 88% actual beef, with the rest made up of fillers, seasonings, and other non-beef ingredients. The situation escalated when a class action lawsuit was filed against Taco Bell, accusing the chain of misleading consumers by not clearly disclosing the true contents of its beef. The controversy led to a public relations nightmare for Taco Bell, which was forced to change its recipe and improve transparency about its ingredients. Now, let's move on to another colorful trend: EZ squirt ketchup in neon colors. Bright, vibrant candy, the kind that catches your eye from the candy shop window, was not always as safe as it looked. Back in the early 1900s, candy makers used coal tar dyes to give their products a burst of color. These dyes, derived from the same source as the industrial byproduct of coal, made candies, jellies, and even fruit preserves look more appealing. But the colorful sweetness came with a deadly cost. The dyes were far from food safe, with many of them being linked to harmful health effects, including cancer and neurological damage. They were cheap to produce, easy to use, and highly effective at making treats look more appealing. Unfortunately, consumers didn't realize the dangers, and the practice went largely unregulated until the mid-1900s, when better awareness and testing methods revealed the toxic nature of these coal tar dyes. It wasn't until stricter food regulations were enacted that these dyes were banned. This dangerous practice is a reminder of how far we've come in food safety. Now, imagine a time when even meat was being treated with chemicals for preservation. Let's take a look at the bizarre practice of curing meats with something as harmful as borax. Now let's take a look at another food that was dangerously altered for effect: beer with Cocculus indicus. In the 18th and 19th centuries, beer was often spiked with a variety of substances to give it an extra kick. One of the most notorious additives was Cocculus indicus, a plant-derived narcotic that was used to enhance the effects of alcohol and make the beer more intoxicating. The berries of the plant contain picrotoxin, a poison that can cause nausea, dizziness, and even seizures. In the days before modern regulations and quality control, vendors added these substances to create a stronger, more appealing product, particularly when alcohol was in short supply. While the narcotic did indeed heighten the effects of the beer, it also posed a serious health risk, with some beer drinkers experiencing dangerous side effects. As understanding of food safety and toxicology advanced, Cocculus indicus was banned from use in beverages, and beer began to be produced with strict guidelines to ensure consumer safety. Today, the idea of spiking beer with narcotics is a thing of the past. Let's now move on to another controversial ingredient. Candy cigarettes were not just sugary sticks wrapped in paper. In some of the early versions sold in the early 1900s, there were trace amounts of nicotine in the mix. Let that sink in. Kids were pretending to smoke just like the grown-ups, and sometimes, depending on the manufacturer, they were getting a microdose of the real stuff. No one batted an eye. These candies were everywhere: drugstores, corner markets, even school concession stands. They came in little boxes that mimicked real cigarette packaging, complete with fake filters and smoke puffs made from powdered sugar. To kids, it was fun. To adults, it was just a novelty. But the message was clear. Smoking was cool, and here was your training tool. Tobacco companies did not mind either. In fact, some candy cigarette makers had licensing deals with actual cigarette brands. It was free advertising. It was not until decades later that public outcry and health studies finally shut down the nicotine-laced versions. Today, even the purely sugary versions are controversial and banned in many countries. But for years, they were just another sweet treat in a kid's pocket. And if giving children mock cigarettes sounds wild, the next one turned a notoriously hallucinogenic alcohol into something you were supposed to cook with for your health. In certain coastal communities, particularly in the mid-20th century, school lunches occasionally featured something that would be shocking today: whale or even dolphin meat. These were not urban legends. In some fishing towns, especially near ports or whaling industries, schools substituted beef or pork with what was readily available: marine mammals. It was not widespread, but it did happen. Whale meat was seen as practical, protein-rich, and economical. It was often smoked, canned, or ground into patties and served with gravy or mashed potatoes. In some cases, schools received surplus from nearby processing facilities. It was local, legal, and no one thought much of it. Today, the idea of feeding whale or dolphin meat to children in public schools is not just controversial, it is illegal. The Marine Mammal Protection Act and international agreements now prohibit the hunting and commercial distribution of most marine mammals. These species are protected by law, and their use in any food program would lead to serious legal consequences. Beyond legality, the cultural shift has been massive. Dolphins and whales are now seen as intelligent, sentient creatures. They are not food. They are icons of conservation and marine biology. It is one of the clearest examples of how what was once considered practical and unremarkable is now completely unthinkable. From lunch tray to federal offense, the transformation is total. Feeding children whale meat today would not just raise eyebrows, it would launch an international scandal. Among frontier communities, trappers, and even clergy, there was once a meal so prized that it earned a place at both survival camps and religious feasts: beaver tail. Not to be confused with the fried pastry of the same name. The real deal was a fatty, leathery delicacy enjoyed especially during harsh winters. It was rich in calories, high in oil content, and, according to those who ate it, surprisingly flavorful once properly prepared. Beaver tail was typically roasted over an open fire or boiled until the tough skin softened and blistered away, revealing a gelatinous, almost pork-like meat beneath. The high fat content made it an essential source of energy in cold climates. French-Canadian Catholics even classified it as fish to permit its consumption during Lent, a loophole that speaks volumes about its culinary significance. But necessity gave way to regulation as overtrapping led to drastic declines in beaver populations. Once abundant across North America, the animal became the focus of early conservation efforts. Trapping seasons were shortened, hunting bans enforced, and certain regions outlawed beaver harvesting entirely. Potted meat is something that's definitely not a niche or something Americans are unfamiliar with. As our history says, we've actually been potted meatheads for quite a while now. It was one of the most widely available sources of protein in most American homes after all, to the point that the most popular companies became household names. Whether you were using Armour's Tangier meat or Underwood's slightly saltier ones, It was a spreadable meat product that made the difference between going to bed hungry and going to bed somewhat full. Unlike Spam or corned beef, though, potted meat was pureed and made into almost a mesh of meat instead of anything firm or very chewable. Now you might be wondering what sodium nitrate is doing here, since potted meat is already meant to be a way of preserving it. Industry standards called for more security, though, and preservatives like nitrate help to keep large-scale batches from spoiling. That's no reason to put 300 to 500 milligrams of the stuff per serving, though. I mean, that's enough to really cause some cancer-related issues. While you can still get this nitrate-infused potted meat today, the concentration is a lot lower than it was before thanks to the backlash people gave. We're going to pause for a second and kind of go back to the start. Baseball cards, slap bracelets, and a pouch of shredded bubblegum, that was the trifecta of playground cool in the 1990s. Big League Chew, launched in 1980, was marketed as a fun, family-friendly alternative to chewing tobacco. It mimicked the look of dip, came in a foil pouch, and offered bold flavors like grape and watermelon. Alongside it, candy cigarettes, chalky white sugar sticks, sometimes with a red tip, offered kids the chance to imitate grown-up habits under the harmless guise of confectionery. Both were consumed casually, no prep required. Rip the pouch or open the box, and the role play began. These items weren't accidents of design, they were directly inspired by adult tobacco products. At the time, the goal was relatability, not rebellion. Big League Chew even had the backing of former baseball players who wanted to replace actual dip with something safer in the dugout. Over time, public health researchers began linking these mimic products with normalization of tobacco use among youth. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, increasing pressure from parents, health advocates, and lawmakers forced changes. By the mid-20th century, pesticides were seen as a miracle of modern farming. They promised bigger harvests, fewer pests, and better-looking produce on grocery store shelves. But one chemical stood out above the rest: DDT, or dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane. Used on everything from potatoes to tomatoes, it kept insects at bay and crops thriving. For decades, consumers unknowingly ate vegetables treated with a substance that would later become one of the most infamous banned chemicals in history. DDT wasn't just popular, it was everywhere. First introduced in the 1940s, it became the go-to pesticide for farmers, widely used in the United States through the 60s and still lingering in some agricultural products into the 1980s. At first, it seemed like a perfect solution to pest problems, but cracks in that perception started to show. Scientists began linking DDT exposure to serious health risks, including liver damage, reproductive issues, and even cancer. Worse, it didn't just affect humans. It devastated bird populations, thinning eggshells and leading to drastic declines in species like the bald eagle. The turning point came in 1972 when the EPA officially banned DDT for agricultural use in the U.S. However, residue from past treatments lingered in the soil, and some imported produce still carried traces into the 1980s. Seafood has long been praised as a healthy, protein-rich option, but in the 1960s, some portions came with an unexpected side effect: mercury exposure. As industrial pollution increased, heavy metals made their way into oceans and rivers, accumulating in fish that millions consumed daily. At the time, awareness of mercury's dangers was limited, and food regulations had yet to impose strict monitoring. Consumers enjoyed their seafood dinners unaware that certain species carried levels of the toxic element high enough to pose serious health risks. Mercury is particularly insidious because it builds up in the body over time. While a single meal wouldn't cause immediate harm, consistent exposure could lead to neurological damage, developmental issues in children, and even kidney failure. Pregnant women were at the highest risk, as mercury could interfere with fetal brain development. Yet, in the mid-century push for convenience and affordability, few questioned what lurked beneath the surface of their favorite fish dishes. It wasn't until the 1970s, after growing scientific research and public outcry, that regulatory agencies like the FDA established strict mercury limits in seafood. Number 16. Selling the raw cream skimmed off the morning milk. Every milk cow in the hollow gave more than one family could drink, so the thick yellow cream got skimmed, churned, or carried down the road to a neighbor or a relative across the county line. It never saw a pasteurizer in its life, and that was the whole point. Here is why that jar of homemade cream could never be sold today. In August of 1987, the Food and Drug Administration finalized a regulation, codified at 21 CFR 1240.61, requiring that all milk and milk products in final packaged form be pasteurized before they cross state lines for human consumption. The agency had spent years tracking outbreaks tied to raw milk and concluded that pasteurizing was the only reliable way to make it safe. So the unpasteurized cream that the hook of this list promised, the kind the Hill Country Kitchen ran on, is now barred from interstate sale by federal law. A neighborly swap across the county line is no longer a neighborly thing at all. By the way, real quick before we keep counting down, if your own people cook this way and you want to keep a few of these old Hill Country dishes alive in your own kitchen, we have pulled the safe, legal versions together into a vintage recipe guide. There is a link waiting for you down in the description. Now, back to the list. If you were a kid in the early 2000s, you probably remember the excitement that came with the release of Easy Squirt Ketchup in neon colors. This bright and bold condiment was marketed as a fun way to get kids to eat their veggies. After all, what kid wouldn't be excited about eating a hamburger topped with purple ketchup? The neon colors, from bright green to shocking purple, were designed to capture the attention of children and make meals more exciting. But despite its popularity, Easy Squirt Ketchup was packed with artificial dyes that were soon under scrutiny. Many health experts and food safety advocates started questioning the long-term effects of consuming so many synthetic dyes, particularly on children's health. In some regions, these dyes have since been banned or heavily restricted due to their potential links to hyperactivity and other behavioral issues. Speaking of short-lived food trends, let's look at a controversial ingredient that lasted a bit too long: trans fat-packed Crisco baking sticks. Unpasteurized milk, often delivered straight from the cow, was a common sight in many households during the early 1900s. Unlike today, where pasteurization is a standard practice to kill harmful bacteria, milk back then was consumed without any treatment to eliminate pathogens. This milk was often still warm from the cow, giving it a rich, fresh taste, but it also posed serious health risks. Unpasteurized milk could contain harmful bacteria such as tuberculosis, brucellosis, and E. coli, which could lead to serious illnesses or even death. Many people unknowingly consumed this milk, relying on local milkmen who delivered it directly to their doors. The practice continued for decades, as the importance of pasteurization wasn't widely understood. The milk, often sold in large glass bottles, was sometimes even reused, adding another layer of contamination risk. Despite the potential dangers, people were often unaware of the risks or simply had no other choice. It wasn't until scientific advancements revealed the connection between unpasteurized milk and foodborne illnesses that the practice started to be phased out. Today, drinking raw milk is illegal in many places, but back in the 1910s, it was just part of everyday life. If you think that was bad, though, wait until you hear about the dangers lurking in your canned food. Let's move on to how lead seals were once used to close cans, unknowingly introducing a whole new level of risk. Let's dive into a food practice that used to be common for color: pickles soaked in copper sulfate for color. Bright neon green pickles were once a popular visual treat, particularly in jars lining grocery store shelves. The vibrant color was achieved using copper sulfate, a toxic heavy metal compound that gave the pickles their eye-catching, unnatural hue. While it may have made the pickles look more appealing, copper sulfate was also dangerously poisonous when ingested. Chronic exposure to copper can lead to liver and kidney damage, and even acute poisoning can cause gastrointestinal distress, nausea, and vomiting. Despite the health risks, the practice of using copper sulfate in food was once widespread, especially in pickles and other preserved vegetables. As food safety regulations tightened over the years, Copper sulfate was banned in food products, and pickles were no longer allowed to be artificially colored with this harmful compound. Today, the bright green hue of pickles is either naturally achieved or left to a more muted, authentic color. As we've seen with food additives, safety regulations have evolved. When Spam took off during wartime, every company wanted in, but not all of them played by the rules. Knockoff versions flooded the market, made with whatever meat-like substance the factories could scrape together. These canned goods looked similar, rectangular shape, same metal packaging. But what was inside could be anything from pork trimmings to offal, and in some cases, even uninspected meat from unknown sources. The labels were vague, the ingredients legally allowed to stay mysterious, and food regulations were still in their infancy. People bought them anyway because they were cheap, shelf-stable, and easy to fry up for dinner. Plus, with rationing in full swing, families were grateful for anything resembling meat. Some brands got so bad, though, that soldiers joked about them in letters home, calling them mystery loaf or wartime surprise. The taste? Salty, rubbery, sometimes with weird gelatinous bits that refused to fry. Still, millions of cans were sold across the country, and they filled pantries from coast to coast. Today, food labeling laws are much stricter, and meat sourcing is carefully tracked. But during the war? It was eat now, ask questions never. And if mystery meat was not enough of a gamble, wait until you hear what people were biting into when they took a juicy bite of fruit, fresh off the tree and drenched in unwashed pesticide. There was a time, and not that long ago, when horse meat was just another item at the grocery store, especially during times of economic hardship like the Great Depression and both World Wars. Horse meat was seen as a practical alternative to beef. It was cheaper, leaner, and in some places even preferred. Entire butcher shops were dedicated to it. Ads ran in local papers. Recipes were published in cookbooks. And yes, people knew it was a horse. It was not a secret. It was just food. What changed? In the United States, cultural attitudes toward horses began to shift. No longer viewed as just working animals, horses became companions, pets even. The idea of eating a horse started to feel wrong, taboo, even unethical. By the 1970s, most Americans had turned away from the idea altogether. Federal laws began to tighten. Today, selling horse meat for human consumption is banned in many states. Even where it is not outright illegal, slaughtering horses for food faces strict restrictions, and facilities that process horse meat for people are nearly non-existent. Yet in other parts of the world, horse meat is still eaten and even celebrated. But here in the United States, it is not just off the table, it is off limits. You know what else is off limits now? Bear meat. At one time, if you strolled through a diner in the Midwest or passed by a county fair in Indiana, you might have found a regional favorite that's nearly disappeared from American plates: brain sandwiches. Typically made with calf or pig brains, this dish was born from necessity. Every part of the animal was used, and nothing was wasted. Brains, though delicate, were considered a delicacy by many working-class families, especially in areas shaped by German-American culinary traditions. The preparation was as straightforward as it was bold. Brains were soaked, sliced, dredged in flour or cornmeal, then pan-fried until crispy on the outside and tender within. Served between slices of white bread or on a hamburger bun, often with mustard or onions, the brain sandwich offered both protein and pride in thriftiness. For decades, it was a staple in certain regions. But in the 1990s, concern over bovine spongiform encephalopathy, better known as mad cow disease, changed the conversation. Though most U.S. cases involved older cattle, federal regulations tightened, and the use of brain tissue in human food was heavily restricted or banned. Now, sassafras tea was a beverage that most people had considered a very old tradition. Despite that, you may have never heard of it. This was something you would most commonly see in the Appalachian regions and the rural South. Native Americans were the first ones to ever introduce the settlers to the plant, and it was a very popular folk medicine. A lot of Native Americans put a lot of stock in its fever-managing, blood-purifying qualities. Back then, fevers were just about as common as zits, so having handy little herbal remedies was a godsend. It was really cheap, it was always available, even in grocery stores and medicine shops, and it was very easy to make. You could get dried sassafras root and that was it. You might be surprised that people often had it with root beer, though. A pint of Hires or A&W along with your tried and tested root remedy was actually a pretty common pairing for people. Plus, traditional root beer recipes were made with sassafras, so that's also why it went together really well. It wasn't until studies found out that sassafras contained safrole in it, which is pretty harmful to your liver. For kids growing up in the 1990s, few things rivaled the thrill of opening a fast food meal and discovering a plastic toy inside. Whether it was a miniature transformer, a movie tie-in figurine, or one of those oddly satisfying spinning tops, the toy often outshined the burger itself. These plastic freebies weren't just fun, they were strategic. Chains like McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's used them to build brand loyalty young and early. But here's the twist. Back then, many of these toys were distributed without explicit choking hazard labels, even when they contained small, detachable parts. The appeal was obvious. The toys were produced cheaply, shipped globally, and bundled into value meals with no preparation. Just insert, seal, and serve. For the companies, it was a marketing goldmine. For parents, it was an easy win at the dinner table. But for regulators, it became a growing concern. By the late 90s and early 2000s, a number of child injuries and even fatalities linked to toy-related choking incidents prompted stricter federal oversight. The Consumer Product Safety Commission began enforcing labeling requirements more aggressively, especially for items marketed to kids under 3. By the 1980s, store-bought pudding had become a staple in American households. Creamy, convenient, and kid-approved, it was an easy dessert that required no effort. Just peel back the foil lid and dig in. But what many people didn't realize was that their favorite tapioca pudding contained an ingredient that would later be banned in several countries: carrageenan. Extracted from red seaweed, carrageenan was widely used as a thickening and stabilizing agent in dairy products. It gave pudding a smooth, uniform texture while preventing separation, making it a dream ingredient for food manufacturers. But there was a catch. Studies later suggested that carrageenan could trigger digestive inflammation and even contribute to serious gastrointestinal issues, including ulcerative colitis. For decades, the FDA and other regulatory agencies debated its safety. While food manufacturers insisted it was harmless in small amounts, consumer advocacy groups pushed for stricter oversight. Eventually, growing health concerns led to carrageenan being banned in certain organic products and phased out of many conventional foods. Despite the controversy, pudding sales never really suffered. Manufacturers simply reformulated their recipes, and shoppers continued grabbing their favorite brands off the shelves. In an era defined by boundless optimism and experimental remedies, a curious tonic emerged: Radithor, or radioactive water. During a time when scientific breakthroughs were celebrated without the benefit of modern safety protocols, this radium-infused elixir was marketed as a miracle drink, promising renewed vitality. Companies boldly touted its rejuvenating properties while food safety oversight was in its infancy, and regulations lagged behind the fervor for innovation. Although endorsements by well-known figures lent it credibility, users eventually discovered that regular consumption led to severe health risks, including bone decay and radiation poisoning, a grim reminder that not every scientific experiment was a step forward. Intriguingly, advertisements depicted Radithor as a fountain of youth in a bottle, a claim that today would undoubtedly trigger public outcry rather than applause. Its popularity stemmed from the era's trust in emerging technologies and a willingness to embrace unconventional treatments during uncertain times. The tale of Radithor serves as a compelling chapter in our culinary and pharmaceutical history, highlighting a period when progress sometimes outpaced prudence. Number 17, a mess of poke salad picked from the fence row. In early spring, when the garden was bare, Hill families went out to the field edges and cut the first tender shoots of pokeweed for a green that tasted like a cross between spinach and asparagus. It was free food when there was no other, and a southern table staple. What few of them said out loud is that the whole plant is genuinely poisonous. Every part of pokeweed carries toxins, heaviest in the root, stem, and leaves. The old method was to boil the young greens, pour off the water, then boil them again in fresh water to leach the poison out. But poison centers across the South still log cases of people who followed that exact method and got violently sick anyway. Health authorities now warn against eating it at all, and you will never see it offered for sale. That free spring green sits one bad boil away from a hospital visit. Imagine digging into a bowl of delicious raw cookie dough ice cream, only to learn that the eggs inside could pose a serious health risk. Before pasteurization became a mandatory practice for eggs, raw cookie dough, whether in ice cream or just as a treat, was a risky indulgence. While the flavor was undeniably irresistible, the presence of raw eggs brought the real threat of salmonella. For many, this wasn't a concern, as the risks were often unknown or overlooked. However, as awareness of foodborne illnesses grew, experts and health authorities started to warn against the consumption of raw eggs. Salmonella can cause severe food poisoning, leading to symptoms like vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal cramps, particularly dangerous for children, the elderly, and anyone with a weakened immune system. With so many quirky food trends of the past, let's take a look at one of the most bizarre: Orbit's drinks with floating balls. In the early 1900s, absinthe was a popular drink, known for its mind-altering effects, and it was often consumed by artists and writers seeking inspiration. But absinthe wasn't just limited to beverages. It found its way into candy as well. Absinthe-laced candies became a unique and, at the time, a highly sought-after treat. These sweets were infused with the same potent herbal drink and marketed as a fun, quirky way to experience the effects of absinthe without having to drink it. The candies were often colorful, featuring the signature green hue of the drink, and were believed to provide a burst of energy or even a sense of euphoria. It wasn't unusual for kids to get their hands on these absinthe-laced candies. The problem, however, was that the absinthe in these candies contained thujone, a toxic chemical compound found in wormwood, which was known to cause hallucinations, seizures, and long-term neurological damage. By today's standards, it's hard to believe that these types of candies were once sold so freely. As the dangers of absinthe became clearer, governments began banning its use in food products. Today, absinthe and its derivatives are heavily regulated, and the idea of feeding such a powerful substance to children seems unthinkable. But back then, it was just another dangerous trend. Now let's move on to another unsafe practice from the past: milk adulterated with chalk or plaster dust. To increase profits, some unscrupulous milk vendors resorted to watering down their milk and adding fillers like chalk or plaster dust. These additives were cheap and plentiful, making them an easy way to bulk up the product without sacrificing too much on volume. Unfortunately, this practice left consumers with milk that was less nutritious and potentially harmful. Chalk and plaster dust might have increased the appearance of volume, but they offered no real nutritional value and posed serious health risks. These practices were part of a larger issue of food adulteration during a time when regulations were lax and consumers had little protection. Over time, stricter regulations and quality controls were put in place to ensure that milk and other food products met basic safety standards. Today, milk is carefully monitored to prevent such adulteration, but the history of these dangerous additives is a reminder of why food safety is so crucial. Next, and speaking of things that looked sweet and innocent but came with a chemical twist, let us talk about what was hiding inside your favorite candy. Picture this. You walk into a general store in 1905 and see jars full of jawbreakers, striped sticks of peppermint, and gumdrops in every color of the rainbow. Looks delicious, right? But here is the problem. Those bright colors came from coal tar, as in the stuff they use to pave roads and seal roofing tiles. Before anyone thought twice about food safety, coal tar dyes were the standard for candy. The more neon it looked, the more kids wanted it. And guess what? Parents were totally on board. Nobody was talking about side effects, allergies, or toxicity. By the late 1930s, the government finally started regulating what could legally go into candy, and coal tar did not make the cut. Today, a lot of artificial dyes are still controversial, but nothing compares to the coal tar days. It is wild to think a stick of candy once came with a side of industrial chemicals, but if you think candy was bad, wait until you find out what they were doing to your daily bread. You would think something as basic as bread would be safe, right? Along with vegetables, many families raised rabbits for meat. They were small, quiet, easy to feed, and reproduced quickly, making them an ideal source of protein when times were tight. But raising rabbits was only part of the story. Many people began selling them at roadside stands, freshly butchered, often still warm and entirely unregulated. Neighbors and passers-by would pull over, hand over a few coins, and take home dinner. There were no labels, no expiration dates, and definitely no inspections. It was normal, even encouraged, during the war. Fast forward to today, and that same practice would land you in legal trouble. United States Department of Agriculture regulations now require strict oversight for meat sales. Selling backyard rabbit meat might have fed a nation once, but today it would bring the government to your door. When meat was scarce and protein needed stretching, Americans didn't always turn to the farm. Sometimes they turned to the sea. In the early 20th century, whale meat appeared in butcher shops and on menus, especially during wartime rationing and economic hardship. Though more commonly associated with Nordic and Japanese cuisine, whale was considered a practical solution during shortages, praised for its abundance and high fat content. The meat, often compared to beef but with a distinctly fishy undertone, was typically boiled, stewed, or ground into patties. It was even served in school cafeterias during World War II. Whale burgers? Anyone? Though not a hit with every palate, it was affordable, filling, and, at the time, seen as a reasonable use of natural resources. But necessity collided with consequence. Industrial whaling operations grew, and so did the toll on global whale populations. By the mid-1900s, many species were facing near extinction. International pressure mounted, and by the 1980s, the International Whaling Commission implemented a moratorium on commercial whaling. In the U.S., the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 made it illegal to hunt, sell, or consume whale meat, with very limited exceptions for indigenous communities. Lead-soldered canned foods were actually a lot more common than you would think. Leading just is a bad idea, but I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they didn't know what they were doing back then. It was a pretty unrecognized public health risk. Canning technology was definitely picking up speed, but the deep, nitty-gritty effects of all this modernization were still subjects that were being studied. Lead-based soldering was unfortunately too common before all of this advancement, and it was extremely common throughout military rationing. Now, modern industries use welded seam canning, but most cans had been sealed with lead because it was really easy to work with, making sure that the can was as airtight as it could be. It was very resistant to corrosion, and it had a very long shelf life. The issue happens when, literally anything unexpected occurs. Say you're just chatting away with your wife while you unpack the groceries and get them ready for the shelf, and you just happen to drop a can. Happens to the best of us, right? Well, let's say the interior was damaged because the big bad fall actually hurt the can. Now you have your food in contact with lead. Let's say it wasn't your fault at all, it was just soldered improperly. Introduced nationally in the early 1990s, supersized fries and drinks weren't just menu items. They were cultural icons of excess. For an extra 39 cents, customers could tack on over 600 calories to their meal, turning a quick bite into a small feast. The fries came in cartons big enough to be mistaken for mailboxes, while the sodas? Let's just say they had more fluid ounces than a bottle of wine. Fast food chains were competing to offer more for less, and customers were more than happy to supersize everything from meals to their waistband measurements. The preparation process didn't change, just the quantity. The fries were the same golden sticks of salt and oil, but now in amounts better suited for sharing, or not. It all came to a halt in 2004. Following increasing scrutiny over portion sizes and health concerns, plus the release of Super Size Me, a documentary that connected the dots between fast food and rising obesity rates, McDonald's pulled the plug. For generations, sweetened condensed milk was a kitchen essential. It made its way into homemade fudge, classic pies, and that ever-popular 80s favorite, key lime pie. Thick, creamy, and packed with enough sugar to satisfy any sweet tooth, it was a staple in American pantries. But while the contents of the can were beloved, the can itself turned out to be the real problem. Throughout the 20th century, food manufacturers lined metal cans with bisphenol A, a chemical designed to prevent corrosion and extend shelf life. It seemed like a practical solution, but there was a downside. BPA is an endocrine disruptor, meaning it can interfere with hormones. Studies later linked it to potential health risks, including fertility issues, developmental problems, and even increased cancer risk. And yet, for decades, consumers had no idea they were getting more than just milk and sugar with every spoonful. By the late 2000s, as public concern grew, regulatory agencies began imposing restrictions. Many food companies voluntarily switched to BPA-free packaging, though debates over the chemical's safety continued. In a period marked by rapid industrialization and cost-cutting innovations, one controversial ingredient left its mark on the processed meat industry: canned pink slime meat. Emerging as a byproduct of the 1960s surge in mass-produced foods, this product was initially celebrated for its efficiency and affordability, which resonated with a public eager for convenience amid economic uncertainties. At a time when regulatory oversight was still developing, its inclusion in everyday meals proceeded with minimal scrutiny, a situation that would later prompt significant policy revisions. Although it provided an economical solution for meat processors, consumers soon discovered that the product harbored potential health risks, ranging from digestive disturbances to concerns over long-term exposure to industrial chemicals. Advertisements touted its value as an innovative way to extend meat supplies, a claim that seemed almost too good to be true once adverse health impacts came to light. As the scientific community began to unravel the full implications of ingesting such additives, regulatory agencies tightened standards and its usage was eventually curtailed in many applications. Number 21. Simmering supper in the old lead-glazed crockery. Those heavy redware crocks and bean pots, glazed to a deep honey shine, were the pride of many a hill kitchen and got handed down like heirlooms. Cooks slow-cooked pinto beans in them, soured kraut in them, and stored buttermilk and stewed tomatoes in them for days. The trouble lives in the glaze. When that old pottery was fired at too low or too uneven a heat, the lead never fully bonded into the glass surface, and it leaches straight into the food. Acidic dishes pull it out fastest, which means the very beans, kraut, and tomatoes those crocks were made for were the worst offenders. The Food and Drug Administration now warns flatly against cooking, serving, or storing food in any pottery that tests for leachable lead, and a single family in New York was poisoned this way as recently as the last few years. That cherished bean pot is now a hazard the agency tells you to retire. Lunchables, the ultimate grab-and-go meal for kids, has long been a lunchtime staple. The prepackaged trays, filled with slices of ham, cheese, crackers, and a sweet treat, made it easy for busy parents to pack a meal that their children could easily eat between school activities. However, earlier versions of these iconic snack packs included ham that was preserved with nitrates and nitrites, chemicals now known to increase the risk of certain cancers. These preservatives, while effective at extending shelf life, have fallen out of favor due to their potential health risks. In addition to the preservatives, the sodium content in the meats was higher than what current school food guidelines allow. The inclusion of nitrates and nitrites has been reduced or replaced by safer alternatives, and sodium levels have been reduced as part of efforts to provide healthier options for kids. Speaking of food that once pushed the limits of regulation, let's move on to Hostess Chocodiles. which used to be shelf-stable for a reason. In the 1910s, canned food became a staple in many households. Cans allowed food to be stored for long periods, and they were often seen as a safe and convenient way to preserve meals. However, the process of sealing cans involved using lead, a toxic metal, which unknowingly contaminated the food inside. The lead seals would leak into the food over time, especially if the cans were improperly stored. Lead poisoning is a serious condition that affects the nervous system and can cause developmental delays, abdominal pain, and even death. Yet, for decades, people were consuming food that was sealed with lead without realizing the dangers. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the toxic effects of lead were fully understood and the government took action to regulate its use in food packaging. Lead poisoning from canned goods became a public health concern, with many people unknowingly suffering from its effects. This dangerous practice continued until more effective methods of food preservation were developed. But if you thought food safety couldn't get worse, there's more. Let's move on to another strange practice from the past: absinthe-laced candies. These sweets were as dangerous as they were bizarre, and kids were often the unsuspecting consumers. While we've come a long way, the use of hazardous substances in food preparation is still an issue today. Speaking of harmful substances, let's explore another dangerous preservative used in food: sausages preserved in formaldehyde. In the past, preservation methods were often as concerning as they were convenient. One of the most shocking methods involved the use of formaldehyde to preserve sausages. The chemical, known for its use as an embalming agent, was used to keep sausages fresh longer. While it prevented spoilage, it also introduced a deadly risk. Consuming even small amounts of formaldehyde can cause serious harm, including respiratory problems, liver damage, and even cancer with long-term exposure. The use of formaldehyde in food preservation would make today's USDA regulations shudder, but back then, it was just a common practice. Salads in the early 1900s were not just iceberg lettuce and ranch. They came dressed in raw eggs, homemade mayonnaise, and a dash of whatever was on hand, then sat out for hours. These were not refrigerated Caesar salads with safety seals. These were countertop creations that looked beautiful in glass bowls, but came with a side of salmonella. And people loved them. In fact, raw egg-based dressings were seen as a gourmet touch. They added richness and that creamy texture people craved. Mayonnaise was often made from scratch at home with raw yolks, vinegar, and oil. No pasteurization, no preservatives, and absolutely no refrigeration once it hit the table. Potluck dinners, family reunions, and church socials all featured salads like this, sitting out in the open for the better part of the afternoon. Today, any salad made with raw egg or left unrefrigerated for more than 2 hours is an automatic health code violation. But back then, it was considered fancy. And if you are still wondering how that did not kill everybody, for generations, lard was not just a cooking fat, it was the cooking fat. Rendered pork fat made at home from trimmings or scraps was used in nearly every recipe. Fried chicken, lard, pie crust, lard biscuits, also lard. And nothing was more iconic than Grandma's cast iron skillet, passed down through generations and seasoned with a century's worth of meals. The lard itself was homemade. After butchering a pig, families would boil the fat down, strain it, and pour it into jars or tins to keep in the pantry. No refrigeration, no expiration dates, just instinct, smell, and tradition. But while home-rendered lard is still legal for personal use, it is now strictly prohibited in commercial settings unless it comes from an inspected, approved source. That is because home-rendered animal fats are not regulated, and using them in food sold to the public violates modern health codes. Even small restaurants or bakeries that want to use traditional methods must use certified lard from approved suppliers. No more scooping a dollop from a tin in the back room. It is a bittersweet shift. On one hand, food safety standards have improved dramatically. On the other, something truly flavorful and nostalgic has been pushed into the shadows. What was once everyday comfort food is now a compliance issue. Grandma's skillet still has a place in the kitchen, but her lard? That is a health inspector's nightmare if it ends up in anything you are selling. In the 1920s, fine dining didn't always mean filet mignon or lobster tail. Sometimes it meant a bite-sized bird served whole. Among the more unusual delicacies of the era was fried canary, along with other small songbirds like larks and finches. These tiny creatures were plucked, seasoned, and often pan-fried or roasted with herbs, then served in one piece, bones, beak, and all. The dish wasn't born of extravagance alone. In parts of Europe and among immigrant communities in America, small birds had long been a source of inexpensive protein. Preparation varied slightly by region, but the general method was simple. The bird was quickly cleaned, often singed over flame to remove feathers, and flash-fried until crispy. Diners would consume the entire bird in a few bites. In some circles, the experience was considered both culinary and cultural, a nod to old-world traditions. However, as bird populations began to decline and awareness of wildlife preservation grew, the tide turned. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, strengthened in later decades, made it illegal to hunt or sell most native songbirds. Conservation replaced cuisine as the priority, and what was once an edible novelty became a symbol of overindulgence at nature's expense. Remember the unpasteurized raw milk? Well, people didn't just use it to drink. They ended up making farm cheese out of it too. It was commonly made in a lot of rural America, especially on family farms and within Amish communities throughout the nation. Safety regulations really weren't what they are now, as you can clearly tell by this point. Raw milk cheeses were considered a way to preserve dairy, while also working as a nice little topping for your meat. Plus, some of them even made enough of the stuff to sell, and they would market it as this all-natural product too. Back then, the dangers of consuming cheese made from unpasteurized milk just weren't well known. Also, this cheese was exceptionally rich and creamy. It had a stronger flavor too, and it would be even better depending on how aged it was. The best one was probably Colby or Jack cheese from the Midwest or California though. At least they were popular until they started causing salmonella, listeria, and brucellosis within the population. This led to a lot more proactive government intervention. The United States Department of Agriculture, for example, started to encourage pasteurization for most cheeses. Throughout the 50s, many states would ban the sale of this kind of cheese, and by the 70s, it got outlawed completely. During the height of America's fat phobia craze in the 1990s, consumers were told fat was the enemy, and Snackwell's fat-free cookies were the shining savior. Launched in 1992 by Nabisco, these treats flew off grocery shelves, marketed as a guilt-free indulgence for health-conscious snackers. With bright green packaging and the promise of being fat-free, they seemed like the perfect compromise. Dessert without the dietary damage. What wasn't front and center, though, was the heavy reliance on partially hydrogenated oils, aka trans fats. The preparation wasn't revolutionary in appearance or taste, but the formula was engineered to replace fats with sugar and processed oils that mimicked mouthfeel. The cookies were soft, chewy, and addictive, which led many consumers to overindulge, assuming fat-free meant risk-free. Ironically, while Snackwells were a symbol of healthy eating in the 90s, the trans fats they contained were later found to significantly raise bad cholesterol and increase the risk of heart disease. By the early 2000s, scientific research and growing public concern pushed the FDA to act. By the 1980s, diet culture was booming, and food companies were on a mission to make everything sugar-free. From sodas to snack cakes, artificial sweeteners promised all the sweetness without the calories. One of the most popular and controversial was sodium cyclamate, a chemical sweetener that had already been banned in the US but was still widely used in other countries. First introduced in the 1950s, cyclamate was 30 to 50 times sweeter than sugar and far cheaper to produce than alternatives like saccharin. It quickly became a favorite in diet sodas and low-calorie desserts. But in 1969, everything changed when studies linked it to bladder cancer in lab rats. The FDA wasted no time, banning it in the US despite ongoing debates over whether the findings applied to humans. Meanwhile, cyclamate continued to be used in over 50 countries, including Canada and parts of Europe, where regulators determined it was safe in controlled amounts. Even today, some experts argue that the original studies were flawed and that the ban was premature. Regardless, Americans had to look elsewhere for their artificial sweetness, leading to the rise of aspartame and sucralose. Crispy, golden, and impossible to resist, French fries have been a fast food staple for generations. Whether served in diners, drive-thrus, or school cafeterias, they were a go-to side for just about any meal. But in the 1980s, some imported French fries came with an extra ingredient that no one ordered: malachite green, a synthetic dye that would later be classified as a carcinogen. Originally developed as an industrial dye and antifungal agent, malachite green was sometimes used to treat potatoes before processing. The goal was to prevent bacterial and fungal growth during storage and shipping. The problem was that this chemical wasn't designed for human consumption, and studies found that long-term exposure in animals led to organ damage and an increased risk of cancer. Despite these concerns, regulation lagged behind global trade. While the FDA never approved malachite green for food use in the U.S., some imported fries, particularly frozen varieties, tested positive for traces of the chemical. Preserving food has always been a challenge, but some solutions turned out to be worse than the problem itself. In the 1960s, some manufacturers used formaldehyde, yes, the same chemical used to embalm corpses, as a preservative in food packaging and even certain processed meats. The reasoning was simple. Formaldehyde could prevent spoilage and extend shelf life, making products more durable for transportation and storage. Unfortunately, what was good for logistics wasn't exactly good for human health. At the time, food safety regulations were still evolving. The long-term effects of exposure to certain chemicals weren't fully understood, and manufacturers often took advantage of the regulatory gaps. Formaldehyde wasn't just a byproduct. It was deliberately applied to some food products, keeping meats from spoiling and even preventing mold growth in baked goods. The catch? It's a known carcinogen and toxic in even small doses. Though its risks were largely unknown to the public, scientists began raising alarms about its potential to cause respiratory issues, digestive distress, and even cancer. By the late 1970s, stricter regulations forced food manufacturers to abandon its use. Number 20. Putting up pickles and kraut in a galvanized wash tub. Come harvest, the big zinc-coated tub came down off the porch nail and got pressed into double duty, soaking cucumbers in brine or holding shredded cabbage under a weighted plate until it soured. It was the biggest vessel in the house, so it made sense. The problem is chemistry. Acidic food and zinc do not mix. The brine and the vinegar eat right through the galvanized coating and pull zinc salts into the food, enough to make a family sick. Zinc poisoning brings on cramps and nausea within hours, which is just why inspectors singled the old tubs out. The Federal Food Code, going back to its 1997 edition, states plainly that galvanized metal may not be used for any food contact surface that touches acidic food. That covers exactly what those tubs were used for. So, the all-purpose wash tub that doubled as a pickling crock is now off-limits for the job. Four Loko, often referred to as blackout in a can, was a drink that became a staple in college dorms across the country. This alcoholic energy drink was packed with caffeine, alcohol, and sugar, an unlikely combination that made it incredibly potent and popular among young adults. People consuming Four Loko experienced intense energy and, in some cases, dangerous side effects, including seizures and blackouts. Medical reports began to surface of people ending up in emergency rooms after drinking the beverage. The mixture of stimulants and depressants posed a significant health risk, leading the United States. Food and Drug Administration to take action. In 2010, Four Loko was forced to remove caffeine from its formula, and the original version was banned. The drink's wild popularity and its rapid fall from grace are a reminder of the risks that come with consuming substances that alter our state of mind. And as we look at drinks that have gone through drastic changes, there's one more that stirred controversy: Mountain Dew with a mysterious ingredient. Before Coca-Cola became the iconic drink we know today, it was actually a very different beverage. In its early days, Coca-Cola contained a small amount of cocaine. While this wasn't unique to Coca-Cola alone, many other drinks and tonics included cocaine as an ingredient. Coca-Cola was one of the most popular products to use it. The cocaine content in Coca-Cola was initially used for its stimulating effects. At the time, people didn't understand the addictive properties or the dangerous health effects of cocaine. It was seen as a harmless stimulant, and it was even marketed as a medicinal remedy for everything from headaches to fatigue. But as the dangers of cocaine became clearer, the company removed it from their formula, and the product evolved into the Coca-Cola we know today. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the government began regulating cocaine in beverages, and by then, the risks were well known. Today, the very thought of drinking something laced with cocaine is shocking, but back then, it was just another part of everyday life. And now, let's move on to one of the oldest practices in milk production: unpasteurized street milk. Let's now move on to a different kind of food deception: coffee adulterated with burnt sugar and clay additives. In times of scarcity, vendors would sometimes resort to extreme measures to stretch their products and cut costs. One of the most shocking examples is the adulteration of coffee with burnt sugar and clay. To bulk up the coffee, vendors would add burnt sugar to give it a bitter, caramelized flavor, and clay to create a thicker texture. The addition of clay, often dirt or other cheap fillers, was intended to increase the weight of the coffee without adding any actual coffee beans. This practice made the coffee less potent, while still allowing vendors to sell it at a higher price. While the sugar might have added some flavor, the clay was a health hazard, potentially causing gastrointestinal issues and posing long-term risks if consumed regularly. The discovery of such practices eventually led to the introduction of quality control measures for coffee production, ensuring that coffee was sold in its purest form. You might think margarine has always been the go-to butter alternative, but back in the early 1900s, things got a lot weirder. The first butter substitutes were made from rendered beef fat. Yes, actual cow fat. And they looked about as appetizing as they sound: pale, grayish, and waxy. So to make it more appealing, manufacturers dyed it bright yellow to mimic real butter. Problem was, dairy farmers were furious. They saw it as competition and pushed for laws banning the yellow coloring altogether. That led to some bizarre workarounds, like selling margarine with dye packets that families had to knead in themselves at home. Imagine trying to color your butter before breakfast. But here is the wild part: people still bought it, because real butter was expensive, and these beef fat spreads were dirt cheap. It was one of the earliest examples of a food product getting heavily politicized, with the government stepping in on both sides, sometimes banning colored margarine entirely, other times requiring it to be pink so people would not confuse it with butter. Today, margarine is made from plant oils and has a long list of regulations. If you think that is strange, imagine a salad sitting out all afternoon with a dressing made from raw eggs, and somehow nobody blinked. Long before there were tea bags or coffee shops on every corner, people made their own herbal teas at home. One of the most popular varieties was sassafras tea, brewed from the roots and bark of the sassafras tree. It had a naturally sweet, slightly spicy flavor and was often served warm during cold months. Some folks even believed it had medicinal properties, like cleansing the blood or treating colds. The key ingredient was sassafras oil, rich in a compound called safrole. And that is where the problem started. In the 1960s, scientists discovered that safrole could cause liver damage and cancer in laboratory animals. As a result, the Food and Drug Administration banned sassafras oil as a food additive. What was once considered a wholesome, homegrown remedy became a health hazard overnight. Today, real sassafras oil is banned from commercial food and drink products in the United States. You can still find sassafras-flavored teas, but they use a safrole-free extract or artificial flavoring. The real stuff? Off the market. You can technically still harvest and brew it yourself in small amounts. But selling it is another story. Homemade sassafras tea with real oil is illegal to sell and flagged as a carcinogen risk. It is a powerful reminder of how something can go from folk medicine to federal offense. Sassafras tea was once a symbol of rural tradition. Now it is a banned substance in your cup. Long before anti-smoking campaigns and warning labels, marketing departments had a different idea: get them while they're young. That's how cigarette-infused candy found its way into the hands and mouths of kids across America in the 1920s. These weren't just sweets shaped like cigarettes. Some early versions actually contained traces of tobacco or nicotine flavoring, all wrapped in packaging that mimicked the real deal. The concept wasn't satire, it was strategy. Candy companies and tobacco brands knew what they were doing, and no one was really stopping them. These candies were made from sugar, corn syrup, and powdered flavoring, often chalky in texture, with one end dyed red to resemble a lit tip. Children would mimic adults, puffing pretend smoke before biting into the stick. It wasn't just play, it was training. Some brands even advertised the experience as just like Dad's. There wasn't a national outcry until the 1950s, when public health data began linking smoking to cancer. Over time, more pediatricians and policymakers raised alarms about these candies normalizing smoking habits. Red dye number 2, or otherwise known as amaranth, was actually one of the most popular artificial food colorings ever produced. If you ever had candy, soda, processed meat, hell, if you bought certain kinds of makeup, there were high chances this was either on your skin or in your system. Now, normally, people didn't care too much about it. I mean, it's the 50s, that's kind of on brand for the time period, right? And why would they? It was resistant to heat, it could be used in liquid form and powder, it was a lot cheaper, easy to produce in bulk, it could be used with everything, and the color was just spectacular. So some of you might immediately express a lot of enthusiasm after hearing that. But some of you might think, what's the catch? Raise a suspicious eyebrow, or just think that this is too good to be true. And you'd be exactly right. The Food and Drugs Administration outlawed amaranth in around 1976 because studies had suggested that it actually increased the chances of cancer. Scientists had begun to link potential carcinogenic effects, and amaranth in particular came under scrutiny. There were all sorts of rumors about it. From your head to your toes, it could give you tumors anywhere like mosquitoes give you rashes. This pretty much sealed the deal for the industry, and as they wanted to get ahead of the issue, the ban became a pretty clear solution. Before taurine and B vitamins dominated the energy drink aisle, another stimulant quietly fueled the late-night study sessions and early gym grinds of the 1990s: ephedra. Often found in energy drinks, diet supplements, and workout enhancers, ephedra was derived from a plant used in traditional Chinese medicine. It wasn't the caffeine that gave these drinks their punch, it was the ephedrine alkaloids, which stimulated the nervous system, increased heart rate, and promised everything from rapid weight loss to laser-sharp focus. In the world of 90s supplements, it was marketed as natural energy, though its side effects were anything but subtle. The drinks came pre-packaged, typically in small cans or plastic bottles, ready to chug before a workout or a night out. Many users combined them with coffee, unaware that they were layering powerful stimulants. Popular among athletes, club-goers, and overworked students, ephedra-based products didn't just sell well, they developed a cult following. Few foods capture the nostalgia of childhood quite like a bowl of wobbly, neon-colored gelatin. Whether layered in a church potluck dish or molded into some questionable 80s creation, Jell-O was an undeniable staple of American households. It was cheap, easy to make, and came in colors that didn't exist in nature, literally. The vibrant hues that made Jell-O so iconic came from artificial food dyes, some of which were later linked to health risks. Red number 3, for example, was widely used in gelatin products before studies connected it to thyroid tumors in lab animals. Yellow number 5 and blue number 1, both common in Jell-O, were also scrutinized for potential behavioral effects in children. While food manufacturers insisted these dyes were safe in small amounts, consumer advocacy groups weren't convinced. By the 1990s and 2000s, some countries, including parts of Europe, began banning or restricting certain artificial colors. In the US, the FDA placed stricter regulations on labeling, and some brands voluntarily reformulated their products. Despite concerns, Jell-O remained a household favorite, proving that nothing, not even a little controversy, could shake its place in American kitchens. In the 1960s, packaging was more about durability and design than long-term safety, and nowhere was that more evident than in lead-based paint on food containers. Vibrant labels, eye-catching colors, and a sturdy finish made these containers look appealing on store shelves. But hidden beneath the surface was a toxic hazard. Lead-based paint, commonly used in everything from household walls to children's toys, also found its way onto food packaging, a decision that, in hindsight, was as dangerous as it sounds. At the time, lead's risks weren't fully understood by the general public. While scientists had long suspected its dangers, regulations were slow to catch up. The problem was that lead doesn't just stay on the surface. Over time, it can leach into food, especially acidic products like canned tomatoes. Consumers had no way of knowing that their favorite pantry staples might come with a side of neurotoxicity. The health risks were severe. Chronic exposure to lead can cause developmental issues in children, memory problems in adults, and even organ failure in extreme cases. As research mounted, the government stepped in. By the late 1970s, lead-based paints were banned from food-related products. The hill country cook of the 1950s never read a regulation in her life, and she would have laughed at the idea that her kitchen needed one. She stilled her own spirits, brewed roots into tea, kept cream that never saw a pasteurizer, and dressed wild game whenever the pot ran low. Every one of those habits kept families like ours fed up the hollers of Appalachia and the Ozarks. And every one of them, by today's rules, would land somebody a fine or worse. Number 24 on this list turns a banned root into a Sunday afternoon drink. Number 16 explains why a jar of homemade cream could never be sold today. Number 8 on this list brings back a trick the federal government quietly outlawed. These were not crimes back then. They were just supper, passed hand to hand because the store was far and the money was short. The law caught up later, and what once filled a plate now sits on the wrong side of a statute. So hit subscribe and let's head up the holler, because here are 25 hillbilly cooking tricks from the 1950s that are now technically illegal. Mountain Dew. Pitch Black was a fan favorite, particularly with its limited edition flavors. However, one of its earlier formulations included an ingredient that would later become the center of a heated debate: brominated vegetable oil. Used as an emulsifier to keep the flavoring from separating in the drink, BVO was a common ingredient in many sodas and sports drinks. Research began to show that BVO could accumulate in the body and potentially cause serious health issues, such as nerve damage and interference with thyroid function. In response to public outcry and growing concerns from health organizations, PepsiCo, the maker of Mountain Dew, eventually announced that it would remove BVO from its drinks. But this isn't the only product that has faced scrutiny for its use of artificial ingredients. Let's talk about shark bites with artificial red dye 3. In the early 1900s, patent meats were sold in tins, marketed as a convenient and cost-effective option for families. The term patent referred to meat products that were patented by manufacturers, promising a standardized product. However, what consumers didn't know was that these meats were often unregulated, and their ingredients were questionable at best. Many of the meats sold in tins contained low-quality cuts, and sometimes they were made from unknown or unsanitary sources. The canning process itself also left room for contamination, as the metal cans were not always properly sealed, leading to bacteria growth in the product. For many years, consumers trusted these patent meats without any real insight into their safety. Health issues linked to unregulated canned meats were largely unaddressed until later in the century, when food safety laws became stricter and more focused on ensuring that meat products were inspected for quality and cleanliness. In today's world, the thought of buying canned meats without oversight seems unimaginable, but at the time, these products were part of daily life. Now that we've seen how meat could be dangerously processed, now let's look at another food product that was tainted with harmful ingredients: canned food with high lead content from soldered seams. In the past, canned foods were a convenient way to preserve meals, allowing people to store food for longer periods without it spoiling. However, the method of sealing cans in the early years of canned food production used lead-based solder for the seams. While this practice was effective in keeping the cans airtight, it also meant that lead could leach into the food over time. The longer the food sat in the can, the more lead it absorbed, making the consumption of such foods a significant health risk. Lead exposure can cause a wide range of health problems, from developmental delays in children to kidney damage and high blood pressure in adults. Today, lead-free solder is mandatory, ensuring that the risks once associated with canned food are no longer a concern. You could walk into almost any drugstore in the 1900s and buy a bottle of something labeled nerve tonic or soothing syrup. It came in a fancy bottle, had a long name like Dr. Winslow's magical elixir, and promised to cure everything from headaches to hysteria. Sounds fine, until you read the ingredients. These so-called patent medicines were loaded with things like cocaine, morphine, and straight-up grain alcohol. People were chugging this stuff like it was orange juice. Adults, kids, grandparents, no one was off limits. Parents even gave it to babies to help them sleep. And since there was no Food and Drug Administration yet, companies could slap anything on the label and sell it as medicine. You did not need a prescription, you did not need a warning label, and you definitely did not know you were taking actual narcotics. It was like the Wild West in a bottle. These days, that stuff would get pulled from shelves instantly, but back then it was as normal as cough drops. If you went to a county fair in the early to mid-20th century, you would not just find cotton candy and funnel cake. In some parts of the country, you would also find squirrel stew, a warm, hearty dish made with freshly hunted game. It was especially popular in rural areas where hunting small game was part of everyday life. Selling squirrel stew was not just legal, it was expected. Local hunters would donate their catch, and volunteers would cook it up in massive pots. People lined up for a taste, often paying to support a local charity or school group. Nobody asked where the meat came from or whether it had been inspected. If it smelled good and tasted right, that was good enough. Today, squirrel stew is nearly impossible to sell legally at public events. The reason? Modern food origin traceability laws. Any meat served to the public must come from an approved source, be processed in a certified facility, and have full documentation for traceability. Caught game like squirrel does not meet any of those criteria. What was once a community favorite is now considered a food safety risk. Even if the stew is perfectly cooked, the origin of the meat alone makes it a liability. You can still make squirrel stew at home, and some rural restaurants may serve it legally under certain conditions. But as far as fairs and festivals go, it is a thing of the past, and it is not coming back anytime soon. Elegant dinner parties in the early 20th century often featured a dish that would be unthinkable on modern menus: canned sea turtle. Prized for its rich, tender meat, sea turtle was considered a luxury item, not just in the United States but throughout Europe. Turtle soup, especially made from green sea turtles, was a favorite among the elite, and by the 1920s, commercial canning made it accessible to a broader audience. You didn't need to live near the coast or wrangle one yourself. You could simply order a tin through a catalog or find it in upscale grocers. The meat was typically simmered into a thick soup or stew, often with sherry, vegetables, and spices. Some recipes called for mock turtle alternatives, using calf's head, but the real thing was the gold standard. In fact, sea turtle was so valued that it became a diplomatic dish, served at presidential banquets and state dinners. The demand, however, outpaced the supply. By mid-century, overhunting and habitat loss drove several sea turtle species toward extinction. International protections eventually made harvesting or selling sea turtles and their meat illegal in most of the world. So another really interesting bit of info about 1950s culinary habits is that slow and steady does in fact win the race. I mean, if you think being turned into a soup is winning, turtle soup was one of the most common ways for people to warm themselves up in the winter, pass the afternoon, or just have something nutritious while still keeping their finances somewhat in check. That was just if you were buying the stuff, by the way. Most people just began to catch their own turtles near ponds, rivers, and other areas where they would be abundant. Turtle soup was seen as this extremely medicinal, rejuvenating dish that would help you get right back up on your feet. Not sure how much of that is a factual side effect of the dish or just plain old placebo, but what I do know is that this odd dish was a regular on everyone's menus. To the point that the government actually had to introduce regulatory laws to help the turtle populations get back on their feet. People began to overfarm them to the point that the local numbers were dwindling badly. They even became endangered, and that's when the powers that be decided it's time to stop abusing these poor little things just hiding away in their shells, minding their own business. For centuries, high-end banquets and luxury dining experiences often featured dishes meant to impress, and in many cultures, nothing signaled status quite like a bowl of shark fin soup. Served at weddings, celebrations, and even business deals, it was a symbol of wealth, generosity, and tradition. One that came at a steep price, not just for consumers, but for the ocean itself. By the 1980s, global demand for shark fins had skyrocketed, leading to a brutal practice known as shark finning. Fishermen would catch sharks, slice off their fins, and toss the often still living animals back into the water to die. It was wasteful, devastating to shark populations, and an ecological disaster in the making. Over time, marine scientists raised alarms, warning that shark finning was pushing several species toward extinction and disrupting entire ocean ecosystems. Despite the environmental concerns, the dish remained popular, with many consumers unaware or unconcerned about its impact. Meanwhile, food safety advocates pointed out another problem. Shark meat is high in mercury, making frequent consumption a serious health risk. In the mid-20th century, the agricultural industry was on a mission to maximize production, and antibiotics played a key role in that effort. One in particular, chloramphenicol, became a popular choice for keeping livestock healthy and increasing meat yields. Farmers saw it as an efficient way to prevent infections in crowded conditions, while food producers benefited from higher output. For a time, it seemed like a win-win, until scientists uncovered the serious health risks lurking beneath the surface. Unlike some antibiotics that merely disrupt digestion, chloramphenicol posed a far more alarming danger: aplastic anemia, a rare but potentially fatal condition where the body stops producing enough blood cells. The problem wasn't just with direct exposure. Traces of the antibiotic could linger in meat and dairy products, making their way onto dinner tables across the country. Consumers had no way of knowing that their Sunday roast might come with a side of medical complications. As evidence mounted, regulators took action. By the 1980s, chloramphenicol was banned in food production in many countries, including the United States. Today, strict testing ensures that no remnants make it into the food supply. Number 14. Hunting a deer for the table and selling the surplus. A buck taken in the fall fed a hill family through the worst of winter, and there was nearly always more venison than one household could eat. So the extra got sold or swapped down the road, smoked sausage for cash, a hindquarter for a debt. Market hunting like that is now almost entirely outlawed. The Federal Lacey Act, first passed in 1900, makes it illegal to sell, transport, or trade any wildlife taken in violation of state or federal game law. The instant you sell wild venison across a state line, or sell a deer taken out of season, a simple swap becomes a federal crime, and once the value tops $350, it climbs to a felony. The casual sale of wild meat that once carried families through the cold months is now one of the oldest prohibitions on the books. In the early 2000s, McDonald's took the concept of fast food to another level with its supersized meals. These meals weren't just big, they were enormous, with portions so massive that they could easily feed an entire family. The most infamous of them all was the supersized soda and fries combo, which quickly became a symbol of American overindulgence. The outrage intensified after the release of the 2004 documentary Super Size Me, where director Morgan Spurlock gained worldwide attention for eating only McDonald's for a month and documenting the dramatic effects on his health. Following the controversy, McDonald's discontinued the supersized meals and began introducing healthier alternatives. The impact of the supersize era is still felt today in the ongoing debates about portion control. Now, let's move on to a different kind of controversy, one that involved the most colorful drink around, blue Pepsi. Looking back, it's shocking that something so harmful was so commonly used in food preservation. And speaking of risky ways to stay healthy, let's move on to another dangerous product, radium-laced tonic water. During the early 1900s, people were fascinated by the idea of radiation and its supposed health benefits. After all, radium was seen as a miracle substance that could cure all sorts of ailments. In fact, it was touted as a source of vitality and energy, and it wasn't long before radium started to show up in all sorts of products, including tonic water. Yes, you read that correctly. Tonic water. Some companies marketed radium-laced tonic water as a way to boost energy levels and improve overall health. The tonic supposedly glowed in the dark, giving it an otherworldly appeal that only added to its allure. While radium was celebrated as a wonder element at the time, it was soon discovered that exposure to radiation was harmful, and prolonged use could lead to severe health problems, including cancer. But in the 1910s, no one knew the dangers yet, and people consumed radium-infused products without any concern. It wasn't until the devastating effects of radiation exposure became clear that such products were banned, but by then, many people had already been exposed. From glowing drinks to stimulating treats, let's now take a look at another shocking concoction, cocaine-laced Coca-Cola knockoffs. Candy made with vermilion. Vermilion, a vivid red pigment made from mercury sulfide, was once used in candy to create a bright, attractive color. It was particularly popular in jawbreakers and lozenges, where its intense red shade made the candy visually striking. However, the dangers of vermilion were well known, as mercury is a toxic heavy metal that can cause a range of health issues, including neurological damage and kidney failure. Despite the risks, manufacturers continued to use vermilion in candy for its vibrant color until the toxic effects became impossible to ignore. The use of mercury sulfide in food products was eventually banned, and candy makers were forced to find safer alternatives for coloring their products. Today, the use of mercury in food products is heavily regulated, and the bright red colors in candies come from non-toxic alternatives. The story of vermilion serves as a stark reminder of how safety standards have evolved in food production. Wait until you hear about the pickled meats people fished out of open barrels, right next to the counter. Picture a general store with wood floors, creaky shelves, and in the corner, an open barrel filled with pickled pig's feet, sausages, or chunks of beef. No lid, no label, no gloves. Customers would just reach in with tongs, or sometimes their bare hands, fish out a snack, and keep shopping. These barrels were often reused over and over, topped off with vinegar, spices, and whatever meat was available. It was salty, sour, and packed with flavor, but definitely not packed with modern hygiene. And yet, pickled meat was considered a treat, something to chew on while you waited for your flour to be weighed or your boots to be mended. Kids loved it, adults swore by it, and nobody seemed too bothered by the fact that these barrels sat at room temperature all day. In theory, the vinegar preserved the meat and killed off bacteria. In practice, it was a gamble. But people took that gamble regularly, because refrigeration was rare and sanitation was still catching up with the rest of society. Today, open barrel food service would be shut down in a heartbeat. But 100 years ago, it was just a snack run. And if that already has you raising your eyebrows, the next one takes weird science to a whole new level. Breakfast cereals that were literally blasted with radiation, all in the name of health. Once a delicacy in old-school kitchens, rooster comb soup was made using the fleshy red crown from a rooster's head. It was simmered into a gelatin-rich broth thought to help with skin, joints, and even fertility. Nothing went to waste. Feet, neck, organs, and yes, the comb all went into the pot. Today, that same soup would be illegal to sell or serve. Rooster combs are uninspected animal parts, which means they cannot be processed or distributed for human consumption under United States Department of Agriculture rules. Risks include contamination and foodborne illness. What used to be clever and resourceful is now considered unsafe and unapproved. If someone served you rooster comb soup today, they would be violating food safety laws. It was a humble dish in hard times, but under modern regulation, it is officially off the table, and probably for the best. Back in the early 20th century, the booming fascination with science collided with marketing hype in a way that made radioactive elements seem like miracle ingredients. That's where radium-laced foods and drinks entered the picture, sold as energy boosters, beauty enhancers, and even aphrodisiacs. One of the most infamous products was Radithor, a radium-infused water marketed with the slogan, "A cure for the living dead." Spoiler, it turned out to be more of a shortcut to that status. The appeal wasn't purely gimmick. At the time, radium had just been discovered, and its glow symbolized cutting-edge health and vitality. In an age without the FDA as we know it today, regulation was minimal, and faith in science in a bottle ran high. Wealthy elites and athletes alike were sipping this glowing concoction with total confidence. Radium was often added to water, toothpaste, chocolate, and even butter. No, this wasn't some fringe trend. Radium-enhanced products were sold in department stores and pharmacies, treated as high-end health aids. The tragic irony? Prolonged exposure led to radiation sickness, anemia, and horrific jaw decay, as seen in the now famous case of industrialist Eben Byers, who died after drinking over 1,000 bottles of Radithor. So, you're all familiar with the way Coca-Cola used to have cocaine, right? Well, in the 1950s, that stopped being a thing, at least on paper. It did, however, still have the coca leaf extract. The very earliest Coca-Cola recipes from the 1880s had small amounts of cocaine from coca leaves, and back then it was pretty common. By 1904, though, amidst growing substance abuse concerns, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was passed, making cocaine officially illegal. By the 50s, the drink was stimulant-free, but cocaine comes from those leaves and the extract they're still using, so what gives? Well, this was a little technical and legal loophole. The Stepan Company was one company that operated during this time and had a nice arrangement with the United States government. It was given the right to import coca leaves, albeit under government supervision, and only as long as all traces of cocaine were extracted. These drained leaves would then be used as a flavoring. This agreement and this company still stand today, and the agreement was even reinforced in 1986. Plus, they had to spend an incredible amount of effort and time rebranding Coca-Cola's image. By the 50s, people hadn't forgotten its powdery past, but they were starting to. That's how it's turned into the mainstream family drink you have in your refrigerator today. In the 1990s, Americans unknowingly became participants in one of the largest food experiments in modern history. Unlabeled GMO ingredients, short for genetically modified organisms, entered the food supply with little fanfare and even less consumer awareness. Engineered for pest resistance or higher crop yield, GMOs were introduced to combat rising agricultural costs and food insecurity. Corn and soy were among the first to be modified, and since those two staples found their way into everything from cereals to salad dressings, most people were consuming GMOs daily without ever realizing it. These ingredients were grown like traditional crops, processed in the same way, and incorporated seamlessly into the food system. The only real difference was at the cellular level and the absence of a label. At the time, the FDA ruled that GMO foods didn't require separate identification if they were substantially equivalent to their conventional counterparts. But consumer pushback eventually caught up. By the 2010s, mounting demand for transparency, along with legal pressure, led to changes. In 2016, Congress passed a mandatory labeling law, and by 2022, food products containing genetically modified ingredients had to disclose that information, though now it often appears under the softer term bioengineered. In the 1980s, not everyone had the patience or the jaw strength for tough cuts of meat. The solution? A sprinkle of magic meat tenderizer. an instant powder that promised to turn even the toughest steak into something butter soft. For home cooks and restaurants alike, these products were a game changer. But what made them so effective also made them a concern. Many of these tenderizers relied on papain, from papayas, and bromelain, from pineapples, natural enzymes that break down muscle fibers. Used in small amounts, they were perfectly safe. But in the 80s, some brands took it too far, loading their products with unregulated concentrations of these enzymes. This led to serious questions about how much was too much. Overuse didn't just soften meat, it started breaking down proteins in the mouth and digestive tract, causing irritation and, in some cases, allergic reactions. Regulators took notice. By the 1990s, some countries banned certain high-potency versions, and the FDA placed stricter controls on their formulations. While meat tenderizers didn't disappear, the magic versions faded from store shelves. Curious minds might raise an eyebrow at the idea that, during the 1960s, individuals resorted to an unlikely source of nourishment: canned dog food. A few families saw it as a last resort in times of hardship. Far from modern-day grocery aisles brimming with processed dinners, resources could be so thin that this canine cuisine found its way onto human plates. Officials often overlooked the contents, leaving potential bacterial hazards unchecked, which wasn't a five-star guarantee of safety. Surprisingly, there was minimal pushback from authorities regarding its distribution. Without modern health inspections, contamination occasionally slipped by, raising concerns about sanitation and disease. Despite these risks, the product's easy availability attracted desperate shoppers, who discovered it was cheaper than most meat options. That affordability turned it into a peculiar standby, although tastiness was sometimes questionable at best. Regulations were not particularly strict back then, so certain labels didn't specify the exact ingredients lurking within each can. Reflecting on that era reveals a culture willing to stretch a dollar when the cupboard ran bare. Number 22. Cooking the wild songbirds off your own back porch. Picture yourself in a 1950s hill kitchen in late fall. Money is thin, the smokehouse is nearly empty, and the dogwoods outside are full of fat little birds gorging on berries before the cold sets in. Your grandfather hands you a slingshot or a fine net, and you go to work the way his people always did. You bring in a string of robins, maybe a few cedar waxwings or a brace of doves, and you pluck them at the kitchen table while the grease heats. You roll the little breasts in seasoned flour, drop them into the skillet, and in a few minutes you have a platter of crisp brown morsels that taste of the wild. You serve them over biscuits with the pan gravy poured on top, and nobody in that kitchen thinks they have done a single thing wrong because the woods were the pantry and a bird in the pot was just supper. Now here is what no one mentions when they romanticize that kind of self-reliance. Almost every one of those birds is protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, a law that makes it unlawful to pursue, take, capture, kill, or possess nearly 1,100 species without a federal permit. It does not matter whether the bird is alive or dead, whole or plucked. It does not matter that you ate it instead of mounting it. If you did today exactly what that grandfather taught you to do, you could face up to 6 months in jail and a fine reaching $15,000, and the game wardens could seize the very net you used. Robins, waxwings, and most of the small birds that once filled a lean seasoned skillet sit firmly on the protected list. The trick that once stretched a poor family through November is now one of the clearest lines in the whole countdown. For generations, Crisco baking sticks were a kitchen staple, found in nearly every home where cookies, cakes, and pies were being made. They helped define the taste of Grandma's famous chocolate chip cookies and were trusted for their consistency and ease of use. But there was a catch. Crisco's baking sticks were loaded with trans fats. These fats, which gave baked goods their smooth texture and longer shelf life, were later linked to a number of serious health problems, including heart disease and high cholesterol. Trans fats raised the bad cholesterol while lowering the good cholesterol, making them a serious health risk. The Food and Drug Administration eventually banned the use of trans fats in many food products. Now, let's talk about another food product that has faced significant scrutiny: unpasteurized fruit juices at fairs. Let's move on to another food trend from the past: lard-rich everything. Lard, a cooking fat made from pig fat, was once the go-to ingredient in kitchens around the world. In the early 1900s, it was used in almost everything, from cooking to baking, and even as an ingredient in packaged food. Lard was cheap, accessible, and versatile, making it an essential part of many recipes. However, the health implications of consuming lard weren't fully understood at the time. Lard is high in saturated fats, which have been linked to heart disease and other health problems. But in the early 20th century, lard was seen as just a normal part of everyday life, and it was used liberally in everything from pastries to frying. Lard was even found in processed foods that we would never expect, such as canned soups, sauces, and even baby food. It was considered a cheap way to add flavor and texture, but its overuse contributed to health problems that weren't understood until much later. As health awareness increased and people began to understand the risks associated with high-fat diets, the use of lard started to decline. But let's not forget how widespread lard consumption once was. Now let's move on to another controversial food. In the 19th century, candies were often brightly colored, making them irresistible to children. However, some of those vivid hues came at a dangerous cost. Arsenic, a deadly poison, was used to brighten the color of sweets, especially green candies. The toxic substance was favored because it produced a vivid, eye-catching shade of green, making candies more appealing to buyers. You would think that taking such a risky approach to your candy won in anyone's best interest, but the use of arsenic in food was a deadly gamble. It wasn't just in candies, arsenic was used in a range of products, from wallpaper to cosmetics, before its dangers were widely recognized. Over time, the deadly nature of arsenic became clear, and it was banned from food products. It's chilling to think that something so beautiful could be so deadly. Now, let's move on to another hazardous practice in food history. If you brought a homemade lard sandwich to school today, someone would probably call the principal or the health department. But in the early 1900s, that was a totally normal lunch for a kid. 2 slices of bread, slathered in thick white pork fat, maybe with a little salt or onion if you were lucky. No meat, no cheese, no lettuce. Just pure rendered lard, spread like mayonnaise. And it was not some odd regional thing either. This was a working-class staple across the country. Lard was cheap, easy to store, and packed with calories, which is exactly what parents wanted for their growing kids. Never mind cholesterol or food safety, the idea was simple: fill them up and keep them going. These sandwiches showed up in lunch pails across farms, factory towns, and coal country. And honestly, some kids loved them. The richness, the saltiness. It was comfort food in the middle of a school day. Today, a lard sandwich would set off every nutrition alarm we have. Wait for it, because the next food was even sketchier. Hunted, dragged in from the woods, and sold out of the back of a wagon with no labels and no questions. In tight-knit communities across America, it was once common for neighbors to buy things directly from each other: produce, preserves, and yes, even wild mushrooms. You would stop by the widow's garden down the street, drop a few coins into a coffee tin, and walk away with a paper bag full of mushrooms she picked that morning from her yard. There was no license, no inspection, no mushroom identification course, just trust, and maybe a little folklore. Some of those mushrooms were perfectly safe and even delicious, others not so much. The problem is that wild mushrooms are notoriously tricky to identify. One wrong pick can lead to severe illness or even death. Back then, this risk was largely unspoken or chalked up to bad luck. Today, that kind of sale is strictly prohibited under most local and state health codes. Selling wild foraged mushrooms requires special certification. You must prove you can correctly identify edible species, follow rules about harvesting, and label everything according to regulation. And even then, some states do not allow it at all unless the mushrooms are cultivated. It is a cautionary tale rooted in community trust, but corrected by modern science. What was once seen as quaint and neighborly is now considered reckless. That brown bag of mushrooms from the lady down the street. In today's world, it is not just illegal, it is potentially lethal, and no health department is going to look the other way. In the smoky cafes of Paris and the tucked-away speakeasies of New York, A vivid green spirit earned both fame and infamy. Absinthe, the original form. Known as the Green Fairy, this potent liquor wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual. Traditionally prepared by slowly dripping ice-cold water over a sugar cube balanced on a slotted spoon, the absinthe would cloud into a pale, opalescent swirl. To fans of the 1920s, this was sophistication in a glass. The main ingredients, wormwood, anise, and fennel, weren't the issue. It was thujone, a chemical compound found in wormwood, that stirred the controversy. Accusations flew that absinthe caused hallucinations, madness, and moral decay. The drink became a scapegoat for everything from artistic eccentricity to violent crime. One Swiss man famously blamed it for murdering his entire family, which helped fuel a global ban. Absinthe had become deeply embedded in European and American culture, particularly among writers, painters, and bohemians. But by the 1910s and 20s, bans spread like wildfire. The US followed suit in 1912, nearly a decade before Prohibition, citing health concerns and public pressure. Have you ever felt so hungry you thought you could take down a whole horse? Well, in the 1950s, that wasn't just a piece of hyperbole, it was a very literal statement. While horse meat never really rose to the heights a tenderloin steak or blue crabs did, it was something that people warmed up to more and more as economic strife and being a US citizen started going hand in hand. Do you remember how we were just talking about trans fats being rooted in World War II-era food rationing strategies? Yeah, that whole period really induced a new way of thinking when it came to food. People were doubling down on making the most of whatever they had and opening their horizons to things they had previously been really dismissive of. Horse meat had a pretty bad reputation, especially since most Americans had a sentimental view of horses. They were pets. They were your next best friend after dogs, they were great workers, and they were beautiful animals you could write poetry about. I think we romanticize anything we can ride into the sunset. But anyway, horse meat started to become a pretty common alternative to beef. Butcher shops would even change the name to have an easier time selling it. But most people started to pick up on the fact that cheval wasn't really real meat. Plus, as technology developed and replaced traditional agricultural methods, a lot of farmers found that they had no real use for all the horses they had anymore. And, well, I know I said they were your second closest bestie, but you'd be surprised what people will do to have fewer mouths to feed, especially if it feeds their own in the process. There was a time when ordering a burger medium rare at a fast food joint didn't raise eyebrows or red flags. In the 1990s, rare burgers at fast food chains weren't just tolerated, they were part of the norm in some regions. Before the E. coli outbreaks that changed the landscape of food safety, undercooked ground beef wasn't seen as a public health concern on the scale we understand today. Chains like Jack in the Box even served burgers with a pink center until 1993, when a deadly outbreak sickened hundreds and led to multiple fatalities, most of them children. The issue wasn't in the prep, it was in the grind. Ground beef mixes surface bacteria throughout the meat, unlike a steak where pathogens live mostly on the exterior. When rare burgers were grilled quickly for that juicy bite, harmful bacteria had a better chance of surviving. The fast-paced kitchen environment, combined with looser regulations, made consistent internal temperatures hard to guarantee. After the outbreak, the USDA enforced stricter guidelines, requiring fast food establishments to cook ground beef to at least 155 degrees Fahrenheit. Today, that pink center has been swapped for safety. You can still get a rare burger, but only at establishments willing to grind meat in-house and accept the liability. At the height of fast food's portion-size arms race, McDonald's rolled out its infamous supersize option, an upgrade that made large look modest by comparison. In the 1980s, alcohol wasn't just about beer and cocktails. A new wave of flavored wine coolers took the market by storm, offering a sweeter, fruitier alternative to traditional drinks. Brands like Bartles and Jamie's led the charge, appealing to young adults who wanted something light, refreshing, and easy to drink. But some companies took things a step further, adding caffeine to the mix. a decision that would later lead to bans and major health concerns. Combining alcohol and caffeine might have seemed like a fun idea, but it created a dangerous effect. Alcohol is a depressant, while caffeine is a stimulant, masking the feeling of intoxication. People drank more without realizing how impaired they actually were. This wasn't just speculation. Studies found that caffeinated alcohol increased the risk of binge drinking, blackouts, and alcohol poisoning. By the early 2000s, newer products like Four Loko reignited the controversy, leading to nationwide bans. But the issue wasn't new. The foundation had already been laid decades earlier with caffeinated wine coolers. Eventually, the FDA stepped in, banning pre-mixed caffeinated alcoholic beverages in 2010. A household staple for decades, canned tuna was a go-to choice for quick meals and affordable protein. Packed with convenience and a mild flavor that fit everything from sandwiches to casseroles, its popularity surged throughout the 20th century. But hidden beneath its silver lid was an ingredient no one had bargained for: mercury. Some brands of tuna contained alarmingly high levels of the toxic metal, a risk that went largely unnoticed in the 1960s when food safety regulations had yet to catch up with modern science. Back then, concerns over contaminants weren't front-page news. The average consumer had little reason to suspect that a simple tuna salad might come with a side of neurological damage. Mercury, a heavy metal that can accumulate in the body, posed serious health risks, especially for pregnant women and young children. Symptoms of mercury poisoning included cognitive impairments, muscle weakness, and developmental issues, hardly what anyone expected from a lunchtime staple. As research progressed, regulatory agencies stepped in. By the 1970s, the FDA began imposing stricter limits on mercury levels in seafood, and today, guidelines recommend limiting the consumption of certain fish. Number 25. The Backwoods Moonshine Still. Up the hollers, a copper still was as much a part of the kitchen as the cook stove, and nobody up there thought twice about it. A family ran corn mash through a pot still, caught the clear liquor off the worm, and used it to trade, to doctor a sore throat, or to splash into a fruitcake. It paid the taxes when crops failed and kept the cabinet stocked when the nearest store was a half-day mule ride away. Here is the catch. Distilling spirits at home is a federal crime under Title 26, Section 5601 of the United States Code, with no exception carved out for personal use. You can brew your own beer and ferment your own wine, but the moment that vapor condenses into liquor, you are looking at a felony carrying up to 5 years and a $10,000 fine. That self-stilled spirit the old folks poured so freely is now strictly off-limits. The 90s brought us some truly strange food trends, and Orbit's drink with floating balls was certainly one of the most unique. Marketed as a novelty soft drink, Orbit's featured brightly colored liquid with small, gelatin-like balls suspended inside. It was like drinking a science experiment, and for a brief period, it was all the rage. People loved the texture of the floating balls, and the drink's unusual appearance made it a fun conversation piece. But as quirky as it was, Orbit's faced scrutiny for its non-compliance with modern food safety regulations. The drink contained several ingredients that were not in line with the more rigorous standards that had been put in place by the Food and Drug Administration and other health agencies. Even what once felt like an exciting drink can suddenly seem like a bizarre relic of the past. Speaking of bizarre foods, Taco Bell's beef formula also caused a stir for all the wrong reasons. Borax, a chemical commonly found in household cleaners and laundry detergents, had another rather shocking use in the 1910s. It was used to preserve meat. Yes, you heard that right. At the time, people were unaware of the potential dangers of borax, and it was commonly added to meats like ham and bacon to help prevent spoilage and extend their shelf life. The idea was that the borax would kill off bacteria and keep the meat from going bad, making it a convenient and cheap solution for preserving food. But what consumers didn't know was that borax is toxic to humans. Despite its dangers, the use of borax in food was widespread, and many people were unknowingly eating it. It wasn't until food safety standards improved that the use of borax in food was outlawed. Now let's move on to a canned food product with no ingredient disclosure: Potted meat. Potted meat, often sold in tins, was a cheap and convenient source of protein for many families. However, the contents of these cans were a mystery to most consumers, as ingredient lists were not always provided. The lack of transparency meant that anything could be inside the tin. In some cases, the meat might have included undesirable or even dangerous fillers, like horse meat or sawdust. These filler ingredients were used to bulk up the product, reducing costs for manufacturers while increasing profit margins. As food safety and regulations improved, potted meat became the subject of scrutiny, and the practice of using questionable ingredients was eventually phased out. While potted meat has largely fallen out of favor, the lack of disclosure in food products reminds us of how far food transparency has come. In the early 1900s, breakfast was not just the most important meal of the day, it was also the most radioactive. Seriously. There were cereals on the market that had been exposed to actual radiation, all proudly advertised as health-boosting. The idea was that radiated wheat or bran had energized properties. These cereals were sold under brand names that sounded vaguely scientific, and they boasted benefits like improved digestion, vitality, and even a sharper mind. In reality, the radiation did absolutely nothing beneficial, and depending on how it was handled, so naturally, breakfast cereals hopped on the trend. Parents fed these to their kids with complete confidence, thinking they were doing something futuristic and smart. No one questioned the safety. Today, irradiated food is tightly controlled and mostly used for sterilization, not for marketing flair. But back then, it was practically a selling point. And while kids were munching down on radiated flakes before school, they were also picking up another childhood favorite, a candy that looked just like a cigarette and sometimes packed a little more than just sugar. In the mid-20th century, gelatin molds were the crown jewel of dinner parties and bridge club gatherings. These shimmering creations were filled with everything from fruit and cottage cheese to vegetables and, yes, raw seafood. Shrimp, oysters, and even thin slices of raw fish were suspended in lime or lemon gelatin and proudly displayed as the centerpiece of a well-set table. The idea was part convenience, part culinary daring. Housewives followed recipes from popular magazines and community cookbooks. If you could suspend it in gelatin, you could serve it. Raw seafood added a touch of luxury, even if the texture left some guests raising their eyebrows. Today, that same dish would violate food safety laws in most states. Serving raw seafood, especially in commercial settings, requires strict temperature control, specific sourcing, and often a special license. And gelatin? It does not offer any protection against harmful bacteria or parasites. The Food and Drug Administration now requires any raw seafood intended for consumption to meet detailed standards. That includes freezing at specific temperatures to kill parasites and ensuring it comes from approved suppliers. A home cook making shrimp jello for friends? Probably safe. A business trying to sell it at a market or cafe? Not happening. What used to be a showstopper at social events is now banned from most commercial kitchens. The gelatin mold with raw fish is no longer a conversation piece. It is a health code violation waiting to happen. Hidden beneath a linen napkin and centuries of controversy, one of the most secretive dishes in culinary history was quietly devoured: ortolan bunting. This tiny songbird, no bigger than a thumb, was considered a delicacy among French gourmets and even found its way to American fine dining circles in the early 20th century. It wasn't necessity that put ortolan on the table. It was indulgence, pure and simple. Traditionally, the bird was captured at night using nets, then fattened in darkness, often with millet and figs. It was drowned in armagnac, roasted whole, and served intact, bones, beak, and all. Diners would cover their heads with a napkin while eating, supposedly to trap the aroma, though critics argued it was really to hide the act from God, or perhaps from dinner companions with less adventurous appetites. By the late 20th century, the ortolan population had sharply declined due to overhunting and habitat loss. France eventually banned its commercial sale in 1999 under pressure from environmentalists and the European Union. Today, catching or consuming the bird can carry heavy penalties, although black market dinners have reportedly continued in secret. Lard was a really dominant fat, as you might already know. It's basically half the flavor in all of our fast food chains, and there are many hamburgers that wouldn't have their reputation without it. There are an equal number of people going to their doctor for cardiac issues at an alarmingly young age due to it as well. But why was pig fat rendered everyone's drug of choice? Well, in fast food frying, it was known for doing a few delicious things. It gave the food a crispy texture like nothing else did. It enhanced the flavor way better than any natural oils ever did. And since pork was already so widely produced and consumed just about, well, everywhere, it was also a lot more available and affordable than, let's say, unprocessed vegetable oils. This meant that it was ideal for the fast food industry, which almost always needed large-scale frying. Nowadays, there are places that still make lard-based fast food like in the old times, but most people were very happy trading away the flavor for the extra health gains. I guess if you really wanted an authentic one, you'd have to find somebody that tried them in the 50s because they used to use proper beef tallow back then, straight from the animal. It's still something you see a lot in little corners here and there, like Mexican-American cuisine or soul food, but as far as the mainstream goes, it's a relic of the past. In the 1990s, before flavored tobacco came under national scrutiny, clove cigarettes were seen as a countercultural badge, exotic, aromatic, and often mistaken for harmless alternatives to standard smokes. Imported primarily from Indonesia and sold under names like Jarum, these unfiltered clove cigarettes blended tobacco with ground cloves and a sweet, sometimes candy-like flavoring. The scent was unmistakable, part incense, part spice rack, and the experience was marketed as smoother, trendier, and somehow more artistic than lighting up a Marlboro. Despite being cigarettes in every sense, their packaging and flavor often appealed to younger consumers. Some retailers even shelved them near novelty items or incense, giving off an illusion of safety or at least ambiguity. They required no preparation, just strike a match, and were typically consumed by puff rather than inhalation, though that distinction rarely stuck. Health agencies began to raise alarms about their chemical composition. Not only did they still contain nicotine and tar, but the clove oil also numbed the throat, which could mask the body's natural reaction to smoke inhalation. In 2009, the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act banned flavored cigarettes, including clove, on the grounds that they appealed disproportionately to youth. For centuries, fresh milk came straight from the farm, unprocessed, unpasteurized, and, at least to its supporters, completely pure. By the 1980s, raw milk was still widely consumed in rural communities and health-conscious circles, with some swearing by its superior taste and supposed nutritional benefits. But public health officials saw things differently, and eventually, the debate over raw milk became a battle between tradition and safety. Unlike the pasteurized milk found in grocery stores, raw milk skips the heating process that kills harmful bacteria. Advocates claimed this preserved beneficial enzymes and nutrients, but there was a significant risk. Raw milk could carry dangerous pathogens, including Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli. Outbreaks linked to raw dairy led to serious illness and, in some cases, fatalities. Regulators took action. The FDA banned interstate sales of raw milk in 1987, and individual states began imposing their own restrictions. Some outlawed it entirely, while others allowed sales under strict conditions, often requiring direct purchases from farms. Despite the risks, raw milk still has a loyal following, with advocates arguing that modern hygiene practices make it safer. By the 1960s, soda had become more than just a refreshing treat. It was a cultural icon. With its bold flavors, flashy advertisements, and promises of instant energy, it was a staple of American life. But some brands took that last promise a little too far. High-caffeine soda wasn't just about a quick pick-me-up. Some of these carbonated concoctions packed as much caffeine as several cups of coffee in a single bottle. At a time when regulations were still catching up to the booming food and beverage industry, caffeine content wasn't something most consumers thought to question. For those needing an extra boost, whether for a long shift, a late-night study session, or just to keep up with the fast pace of modern life, these sodas were a tempting choice. But what went down easy didn't always sit well. Excessive caffeine consumption could lead to heart palpitations, anxiety, and even dependency. Some drinkers learned the hard way that too much of a good thing wasn't always a good thing. As research into caffeine's effects grew, regulations tightened. Today, sodas still contain caffeine, but the extreme levels once found in certain brands have been curbed. Number 19. Digging wild ginseng to flavor a tonic. Sang hunting was a hill country tradition older than the states themselves, and the gnarled root went into bitter teas, restoratives, and the occasional pot of medicine soup. A good patch was a family secret passed down in whispers. The wild plant is now one of the most tightly guarded in the woods. In 1975, American ginseng was placed on Appendix 2 of an international treaty that protects species from being dug into extinction, and the harvest is now boxed in by hard rules. Most states allow digging only during a narrow fall season, only from mature plants at least 5 years old, and selling out of state requires a dealer permit. The Forest Service has flat-out suspended ginseng harvesting across thousands of square miles of Appalachian National Forest, so that quiet walk into the hills to dig a root for the pot now runs straight into a wall of regulation. Who doesn't remember stopping by a local fair or farmer's market for a refreshing glass of fresh-pressed apple cider or fruit juice? In the past, these beverages were a beloved part of the fair experience, often touted as the freshest, most natural drinks you could find. However, these juices, especially when unpasteurized, posed a serious health risk. Raw, unpasteurized juices can carry harmful bacteria like E. coli, Salmonella, and Listeria, which can lead to foodborne illnesses. The move to pasteurized juices was part of a broader effort to reduce the risk of foodborne illnesses in public settings. While the nostalgic experience of sipping on freshly pressed cider is still cherished, it now comes with the assurance that it has been properly treated to protect public health. As we consider the evolution of snacks, let's move on to one of the most controversial diet foods: Olestra chips. Bread that was bleached with poisonous chemicals. In the early industrial era, bread was considered a simple food staple, but the methods used to make it weren't always as simple as we would like to think. To make bread more visually appealing, bakeries used harmful bleaching agents like benzoyl peroxide to whiten the flour. This practice was intended to make bread appear fresh and inviting, but the chemicals used were anything but safe for human consumption. The white bread, which was popular among consumers, looked better on the shelves, but the bleaching process made it far from healthy. People unknowingly consumed bread made with toxic chemicals that could cause health problems over time, from gastrointestinal distress to long-term damage. The bread was often processed quickly to meet demand, with artificial additives used to make it fluffier and rise faster. The government did not yet have the stringent regulations it has today, so these chemicals remained in food production for years, putting the public at risk. It wasn't until later in the 20th century, when food safety regulations became stricter, that the harmful chemicals used in bread production were banned. Today, consumers are more aware of the ingredients in their food, and bread is made using healthier methods. While the process of bleaching bread may be a thing of the past, it serves as a reminder of how far food safety has come. And speaking of harmful substances, let's move on to another troubling practice from the past: cough syrups that contained heroin. Let's move on to another food practice that once seemed harmless: bread bleached with alum or chlorine. In the past, the color of bread was a sign of its quality. Whiteness was equated with purity, and the whiter the bread, the more desirable it was. To achieve that perfect white loaf, many bakers resorted to using chemicals like alum and chlorine to bleach the flour. While these chemicals made bread look more appealing, they also introduced serious health concerns. Both alum and chlorine could cause irritation to the digestive system and were linked to other long-term health issues. In some cases, the chemical load was so high that it raised alarm among health experts. Over time, food safety standards tightened, and these dangerous bleaching agents were banned from use in bread production. Today, we're more aware of the risks posed by chemical additives, but it wasn't always that way. Speaking of dangerous additives, let's look at another food product once tampered with. For a long time, the milkman was a trusted part of daily life. Every morning, you would find fresh bottles of raw milk sitting on your doorstep, unpasteurized and straight from the cow. It felt wholesome, local, and pure, until you realized it could also carry tuberculosis, salmonella, and a whole menu of dangerous bacteria. Pasteurization had not yet become standard, and a lot of people thought heating the milk ruined the flavor. So raw milk stayed king. Families drank it with dinner, mixed it into recipes, and gave it to toddlers without thinking twice. But as cities grew and dairy had to travel longer distances, things got messy. Spoilage became a real issue. So did outbreaks. It was not uncommon for entire neighborhoods to fall ill from a single contaminated batch. By the time the 1920s rolled around, scientists and doctors were practically begging for pasteurization to become law. Eventually, it did. But even today, raw milk still has defenders. Some states allow it, others ban it completely. Back then, though, it was just business as usual. And if that seems shocking, you will not believe what they were using as medicine for children, with a prescription and a smile. Before there were warnings on labels and public health campaigns, there was homemade ice cream. Every Sunday, especially in summer, families would gather on porches or in backyards to hand-crank their own frozen desserts. Recipes were simple: cream, sugar, maybe some vanilla, and almost always raw eggs. That is right. Raw eggs were a standard ingredient in homemade ice cream. They helped create a smooth, rich texture and were considered perfectly safe. No one thought twice about cracking open a few eggs, mixing them into the base, and passing it around to the kids. It was just how it was done. But things have changed. Today, using raw eggs in homemade recipes is considered a major health risk. The Centers for Disease Control and the United States Department of Agriculture warn against eating anything that includes raw or undercooked eggs due to the risk of salmonella. That risk is real, but back then, it simply was not on most people's radar. Now, if you want that same texture in your homemade ice cream, you need to buy pasteurized eggs or cook the base to a safe temperature before freezing it. The carefree days of tossing ingredients in a bowl and cranking away are mostly gone. It is a reminder of how much food safety has evolved. Something as innocent as a scoop of vanilla could now be considered dangerous. What was once a symbol of home and tradition is now a textbook case in foodborne illness prevention. One of the most divisive dishes to survive the journey was lutefisk, a gelatinous preparation of dried whitefish, typically cod, reconstituted in water, then soaked in a lye solution until the texture resembled something between fish and jelly. In the 1920s, it wasn't just a holiday tradition. It was a symbol of cultural identity and resourcefulness. The process was intense. After drying and curing, the fish was submerged in cold water, then bathed in lye. Yes, the same caustic chemical used in soap making. Once the lye rendered the flesh soft and translucent, it had to be soaked again, often for days, to remove any remaining toxicity. Done right, the final product was gently baked or steamed and served with butter, cream sauce, or, if you were lucky, a stiff drink to chase it down. The trouble came with consistency. Home cooks sometimes used industrial-grade lye, unaware of its dangers. With no regulation, food safety varied wildly. Eventually, concerns about caustic burns and chemical contamination led the FDA to restrict food-grade lye use and require careful handling in commercial settings. These are foods that once sat on kitchen tables across America without a second thought. If any of them brought back a memory from your own family's kitchen, share it in the comments. What did your grandmother or your mother put on the table that would raise eyebrows today? Which one caught you off guard? If you made it through the full list, this channel was made for you. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.